fly on the wall for that. Welcome back to Squawk Box. Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris saying she is preparing to unveil an official economic policy platform in the coming days. Over the weekend, she said she disagreed strongly with the former President Trump's suggestion that presidents should have a say in Federal Reserve rate decisions. Joining us right now to talk about so many different issues, the potential of Harris's economy versus a second chapter of Trump's economy. Former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy is here, co-founder of Strive Asset Management, author of Woke Inc. and the forthcoming book, Truths, The Future of America First, is a surrogate for the Trump campaign. Good morning.
Good to see you.
It's nice to see you. So we're all waiting to hear what the Harris economy is supposed to look like. We don't know yet. I imagine we're going to hear more about that in the coming days, if not maybe at the convention itself. But I'm curious what you thought of both the president's view of the Federal Reserve rate issue in terms of his influence on that, and then her critique of that over the weekend.
Yeah, sure. On the Federal Reserve issue, just briefly, the idea that the U.S. president hasn't used the bully pulpit to influence the Federal Reserve, we all know, is a bit of a myth. So it's only a question of, do you want to do it through the front door or the back door? My view on the Federal Reserve, and I do think this is a strong message for Republicans, is the Fed needs to be more constrained in its scope to focus on dollar stability. But I want to go back to Kamala Harris's economic policies. The idea that we don't know what her economic vision is, I think, is actually a little bit off the mark in the sense that we do know what she stood for in the U.S. Senate and as vice president, and as a former presidential candidate.
So I
do think we have a lot to go on there to talk about.
If she pivots, right? And that's what we keep hearing is she's going to pivot. You're going to see this sort of maybe turn to the center. Maybe, by the way, we're totally wrong, and it's like a complete lefty thing. I don't think that's going to be the case. But then I imagine if she does that, then I imagine you're going to say, as others will, and we talked to Kevin McCarthy, that then she's a flip-flopper. And so what are we supposed to either believe or care about?
Well, let's look at the whispers that you're hearing now. Now, supposedly, she's opposed to a ban on fracking. That's about as ridiculous as saying that Donald Trump is opposed to a border wall. Okay, the idea that this is a person who said, it was her words, not mine, that she is absolutely in favor of ending fracking. So much so that as AG in the state of California, she actually sued the Obama administration for granting fracking permits. So you talk about ending fracking. Let's talk about the unrealized the tax on unrealized capital gains. This is a formula for a stock market crash, and I think a second Great Depression.
Well, what I'm saying is if she
goes... these are specific policies she's adopted.
But if she goes the other way, are we supposed to believe her? Are we not? At the same time, by the way, that people look at some of the comments that J.D. Vance made, by the way, about former President Trump, calling him America's Hitler and all sorts of things, said how much he hated him. And now, of course, is his vice president saying that he's changed his mind and he's grown and he's learned. Is it possible that she might?
So, look, I think that we'd have to evaluate what she says on the merits and how substantive her alternative proposals are. But I give the presumption of weight to what she's actually supported, what she's done. So one thing to say someone has said this in the past, they do this today. Let's look at what she's actually done. She didn't just support the Green New Deal, Andrew. She actually co-sponsored legislation to advance it, so much so that she said she would favor ending the filibuster in the Senate to ram that through. What's in that Green New Deal? Replacing aviation travel with rail travel. Net zero by as early as 2030. In that bill, as well as others, she co-sponsored legislation with Bernie Sanders for nationalizing the U.S. healthcare system. So I think actions speak louder than words.
All of that
regardless of her words, I'll look to her actions.
Fair enough, but I think a lot of us, or a lot of voters sense that was then, this is now, and there's a pragmatism, which brings me to the point on crypto that I think is kind of interesting. Pragmatically speaking, you'd think, why not be for it, right? This is so, and you look at what Gary Gensler is doing, going after the industry kind of time and again, and there are those who argue, who think if you're a single voter on crypto, that this could lose her the election if she doesn't come out and embrace it. Look, Trump was all for the not taxing tips, now she's all for. Do you think she will ultimately embrace crypto as an industry?
I predict her verbiage will. And I do think that part of the reason why is you see Trump's speech at the Bitcoin conference. It's just a matter of competing for votes that she's going to adopt a thoughtful position. Now, speaking as an American, not from a partisan perspective, I think that's a good thing. I think we should want great debate in the marketplace of ideas. Even if she offers a thoughtful digital assets framework or policy, even if I don't agree with all of it, I think that'll be a good thing for the country. But what I challenge Kamala Harris to do is not just cite the pieties and the words. Go into detail. Say what you actually believe about self-custody of assets. Say what you actually believe about whether you think Gary Gensler should continue as the leader of the SEC. So I think those specifics are going to matter a lot, Kelly.
For sure, but what you're saying is just a general position of openness is probably all the industry really is looking for. This idea that it's not a partisan issue, that Republicans are for it and Democrats are against it.
It should not be a partisan issue. Now, what I think you are seeing is this tendency to really embrace whatever wins her the most votes. But when you're looking at your question, Andrew, of how do you assess the seriousness of that, the metric to use is how specific she actually gets on those policy proposals. It's one thing to say, I favor private health insurance now. Right. Well, then the question to ask is, why were you on the Democratic debate stage when they asked the question, would you favor abolishing, that was their words, abolishing private health insurance?
Right. And she said
why
yes.
did you put your hand up? You then raise the bar for the specifics you have to offer for exactly what policy vision you have and why you changed your mind.
But she is now the vice president of the current administration. Therefore, you would assume some continuity with whatever was happening currently. And I think the other piece of it is whatever positions in an ideal world she may have had at one point, we have this practical matter of what could actually possibly happen. What's genuinely in play, given what Congress is likely to look at, like next year, in terms of where the swing is.
Yeah, tax policy is up to the big one, Andrew.
Exactly.
I agree with you totally. And the one I'm really worried about, and this is a group that will appreciate this well, is that tax on unrealized capital gains. This has been in the undercurrent of Democratic policy for a long time.
There's no way. You think they're going to...
Biden and Harris has put this in their budget plans for the last several years, even increasing the number for it.
In their plans?
Well, the reality, these are people who are running the country, supposedly, right? The president and the vice president of the United States. And so I do think this is a real formula for a market crash, but it's also something that beyond the stock market.
But we've never even seen the market sell off on that plan. So if they,
the
really
reality is, we also have seen polls until very recently that have favored Donald Trump as the unambiguous next president of the United States. So as this gets impounded into the actual possibilities for the market, I think this is going to be an issue not just for the stock market.
Might see private equity stocks sell off, but I'm not sure Pepsi and Coca-Cola and, you know.
I actually disagree with that, Kelly, especially in the tech sector. You have people sitting on large, long-standing embedded capital gains. And so for people to understand what this means, it means you have to pay taxes on sales that you have not yet made. And even forget the stock market and think about even everyday Americans across this country. That means that if you're a farmer or if you're a small business owner, you will owe taxes with cash you literally do not have in your pocket to pay those taxes. That is a formula for a second Great Depression. And it is something that's been in the bloodstream of Democratic policy for a long time. Go back to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' plans of a wealth tax, even in the 2020 primary. I think this idea is here to stay for the Democrats. That's a big one. I think Tim Walz's selection as vice president says a lot. That's the first real presidential-style decision we've seen Kamala Harris have to make. She went with somebody who at the state level has favored increasing taxes on capital gains. In that case, it was unrealized, but they have talked about unrealized gains and taxing them. And I do worry about that, what that means, not just for the stock market, but for everyday Americans across the country.
The stock market, if there's not 60 votes for that in the Senate, the stock market doesn't have to price it.
Yes, 60 votes, or if you agree.
I mean,
I respectfully disagree with one aspect of that, because Kamala Harris has been the chief proponent of ending the filibuster to ram through her policy objectives.
Yeah.
And so if she's the president of the United States, and in my view, God forbid, a Democratic Senate to aid her, that could be 51 votes. And could you get to 51 votes on a major change in tax policy like that? I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think that's conceivable. And so for a lot of business leaders across the country, one of the questions they might want to ask is, which is going to be the administration that's more friendly to business? Well, we don't know where she stands on tariffs. We don't know where she stands on a lot of other questions. But on tax policy alone, the idea of not just raising tax rates, but raising tax rates and applying taxes on unrealized income, that is a catastrophe of epic proportion.
What do you make of it? Did you see the FT over the weekend with this story we were talking about earlier this morning that suggested that the American public trusts her more than Trump on the economy? So, only by a point.
Yeah.
So let's not overstate over the case, but nonetheless, it's a real shift from what we would have seen even 2 weeks ago.
So this is one of those areas, Andrew, where when I saw the headline, it caught my attention as well. One of the things I've learned is when you see a headline, go down into the details a little bit. That was what the headline said. When I read the actual poll, you said 1.1 direction. It was 9 points in the other direction for Donald Trump when they asked the specific question of which president do you think will actually determine better for your personal finances? Your personal finances would fare better under Trump or Kamala Harris. It was a 9-point advantage for Donald Trump. So I think that, with due respect to the FT, was a little bit of a misleading headline relative to what their own poll actually stated. But regardless, the question is, many voters have not had exposure to what Kamala Harris's policies actually are. I challenge Kamala Harris to sit down in a thoughtful forum like the one we're having right here so we can actually get clear answers on her economic policies. The one area that I'm a little bit mystified by, I think the GOP has not done a good enough job at going after Kamala Harris's policy record on, is her position on health care. Obviously near and dear to my heart. It's an industry that I came from. But do you favor nationalized health care or not? I respect Bernie Sanders because he's been consistent on it. Kamala Harris co-sponsored legislation with Bernie calling for nationalization of the healthcare system, the abolition of private health insurance. That would decimate innovation in the biotech industry, in the medical device industry. Let's talk about it in the open. And I think we deserve to have those actual policy debates rather than what the race otherwise devolves into, is these personal attacks. You hear effectively one of the candidates calling 70+ million Americans weird. You want to know what I think is weird? I think abolishing air travel is weird. I think abolishing the coal industry is weird. I think abolishing private health insurance is weird, not as a personal attack, but because they adversely impact the economic interests of Americans. That's what we should be talking about.
Can I ask you one other question just about how the Republicans are trying to portray the vice president? On one side, there's a view that she's being portrayed as someone who doesn't understand the issues, can't go deep enough, et cetera, et cetera. On the other, there's this view that she is some kind of diabolical mastermind and completely understands exactly what she's doing. And she's, as you would describe, or I imagine, claim that she's flip-flopping, but she knows exactly what she's doing. It can't be both.
I agree with you on that. I think that Kamala Harris is part of a broader system, the same system that Joe Biden is a part of as well. This is one of the things I talked about in my presidential campaign. Frankly, in both parties for much of the last 40 years, the people we elect to run the government are not the ones who are actually running the government. Most policy in this country today is actually set by bureaucrats who were never elected to their positions in three-letter agencies in the administrative state. And frankly, on both sides, I don't think that issue is talked about enough. Backdoor legislation that the Supreme Court is trying to curb.
Chevron.
But the overturning of Chevron deference, I think, is one of the most important decisions to actually shape regulatory policy in the next administration, regardless of who wins. We're not talking about that enough. If you want to talk about the number one piece of economic stimulus that the next president could effect, I think Trump's more likely to do it than Kamala Harris, but I would favor either one doing it, is actually taming a lot of those regulations that have impinged private industry that were never actually passed through Congress. So I'm in the camp, Andrew, of believing that she is just another cog in a wheel. We're not running against an individual candidate. We're running against that system. And I think a powerful message for Donald Trump is to say that we're going in to dismantle that system. That's really what Draining the Swamp was about the first time around. It worked for him in 2016, and I think that's a powerful message that we could leverage even more heading into 2024.
Vivek, I want to thank you.
Good to see you.
Great to see you.
Good to see you guys. Thank you.
Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.